Good morning, everybody. David Shapiro here with another video. So today's video is going to be a little bit less about the narratives around AI and that sort of stuff, and it's going to be a little bit more down to basics. Let's talk business with artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI. Real quick plug before we get started. I am available for one-on-one consultations on Patreon, and I'm also available for different kinds of engagements. Reach out to me on LinkedIn if you'd like to talk about any of the things that I'm talking about here. All right, so getting right into the show, let's talk about generative AI for CEOs, and we're going to look at it at a very high level. So first, we're going to look at it through the lens of people, processes, and tools. All organizations go through transformations, and one of the ways to look at organizational transitions is through people, processes, and tools. What kinds of people do you need, and how does that change? What kind of expertise, training, that sort of stuff? How do your processes change within the business, and then what tools do you use? So this is just kind of the background framing. We're not going to unpack these in any particular order. We're just going to kind of talk about generative AI through this particular lens. So one thing that you can think about generative AI is that it's just more software. At a fundamental level, generative AI is just a new kind of software, but it is still just software. One thing to keep in mind is that technology, computers, software, that sort of stuff, has automated and accelerated business for decades. This is nothing new. It's nothing different. This is just the next flavor. For those of you in the technology space, you might remember how virtualization was a very disruptive technology for the data center, and that ultimately led to the preeminence of cloud computing, which is now pretty much standard. And so the combination of virtualization and APIs and stuff that made cloud computing, the viable business model that it is today. This is no different from how Oracle and SQL technologies transformed the way that businesses handled data. And then, of course, there's everything that Microsoft did for business productivity, from their Office suite to Microsoft Windows and everything else, Team Foundation, everything. So from that perspective, from a software perspective, you can think of generative AI in two primary categories. The first category is that generative AI is a new kind of automation. And so, again, business automation, nothing new. And business automation is also, it doesn't really change. The idea is that you just do more with less, you do it faster, and you do it more reliably. So looking at generative AI through the lens of automation, the idea is that it can take some of the workload off of humans and put it onto machines, and then it can allow you to get more done faster with less and more reliably. That is the entire point of automation. Another thing that you can look at it is, and this is kind of the fundamentally new aspect, is it has to do with decision enhancement. And what I mean by that is that the particularly language models, they can aid with all kinds of things, whether it's judgment, creativity, appraisal, brainstorming, drafting. They can also read a tremendous amount in very short periods of time, which can allow you to make better decisions by ingesting more data than ever before. So by thinking of generative AI in these two categories, automation and decision enhancement, that can really help you target where in your corporation, where in your organization to look at using generative AI. Again, the idea of automation is that you get more done faster, and of course, time is money. Another thing is that you can do it with less. You might be able to do it with less headcount, or you can ideally you take the headcount that you do have, because we don't want to see anyone get laid off if we can avoid it, and then you empower your existing staff to do twice as much, 4 times as much, 10 times as much. So that is, and then of course you can also use generative AI to perform checks and interlocks, which can raise the quality of work and make it more consistent. So those are a few kind of off-the-cuff ways to think about it. Like, yes, generative AI is just more software, but it does give us a couple new capabilities of this software. So speaking of new capabilities, Generative AI mostly right now is text and images, but there's other modalities coming soon, namely video, audio, and a few other things. So what are the baseline capabilities that this technology has? First of all, as a language model, it is primarily based on text, which means it can read everything. It can ingest email, chat, papers, scientific papers, articles, laws, protocols, reports, logs, tribal knowledge in the form of KB articles, documentation, that sort of stuff. So when you have a machine that can read at 1,000 times faster than any human, think of the text-heavy aspects of your business, whether that is combing through financial reports or consolidating knowledge from chat logs, customer feedback. There's all kinds of stuff that is text-based or could easily be rendered as text that you can then just read and get a tremendous amount of information from. Now, the problem there, of course, is you have to be asking the right questions. And there are also still technical limits, namely the window size of some of these things. You can summarize and transform text and information. And so what I mean by that is you can take a large block of text and you can either make it smaller or change the formatting or that sort of thing, which again, this is one of the new tools in the toolbox that allows you to engage with the data that you do have in a different manner. Brainstorming and planning. So this is one of the most powerful aspects of tools such as ChatGPT. It's like, hey, I'm addressing this problem. Help me brainstorm how to approach it. I've used brainstorming everything for writing fiction. It's like, hey, I'm working on this scene. Help me brainstorm a few ways to approach the scene so that it, ticks these boxes, right? You give it some constraints, and technologies like ChatGPT will absolutely surprise you in terms of what they're capable of helping you brainstorm. Because it has a lot more information than you will ever have. And so if you give it the right constraints and the right problem space, it will surprise you and it'll add information to what you're trying to do. Planning. One of the things it's really good at is helping you think through every step of a plan. Brainstorming and planning are among the most cognitively demanding tasks, and we'll talk about cognitive demands and cognitive offload in just a moment. But basically, there are some things that ChatGPT and similar technologies can do that can save you a tremendous amount of mental energy, which then you can allocate to other things, other problems that AI is not yet capable of doing. And then finally, drafting and revising. Whether you're writing a legal document or an agreement or a contract, or even just drafting an email. I mean, I use ChatGPT. It's like, hey, I need to respond to this email. I want to do it diplomatically and explain it clearly. And, yes, I am good at writing, but it's just easier to have the machine write the first draft for me, and then I can clean it up. And then revisions as well. In some of my previous videos, you might have seen where I use the ChatGPT API to provide feedback on my fiction and plenty of other things. I often use ChatGPT for helping actually even make these slide decks. Although I'm getting better at making these slide decks, so I actually need it less, which is a really interesting phenomenon. It's like, okay, I've actually gained new skills by using this tool, and I am better at communicating now, and I need this tool less. Really fascinating. I don't know if that's going to keep up. But anyway, so these are 4 basic categories of new capabilities that you can think of in terms of, okay, what is it that generative AI is actually capable of right now? And then from there, these are kind of the low-level building blocks that you can slot into other products, other services, whether it's internal or external, right? Because you might have internal-facing tools, you might have external-facing tools, and these are things that you can just kind of pipe into existing frameworks, existing processes to make them better. You can also think about these when creating new products and services. Okay, so as I promised, cognitive offload. Most humans are capable of 2 to maybe 4 hours of high-performance cognitive labor per day. Many people less. So an average, a rule of thumb is about 2 hours. So the idea of cognitive offload is that it's like, okay, whatever it is that's difficult, you delegate that to someone else. You delegate it to a machine. Excuse me. You delegate it to a machine. You do something to make it easier. You create a process or you offshore it or whatever. So what are some things that are cognitively demanding? Decision making. There's a phenomenon called decision fatigue. If you follow HBR or SciTech Daily or whatever, there's plenty of research that goes into decision fatigue. And basically what this means is that the cognitive demand of making decisions all day is very, very taxing. It's very draining. And so what happens is that after making too many decisions, once decision fatigue takes over, people will just kind of go with the default answer or whatever they're most comfortable with, or they'll use simpler and simpler heuristics. And objectively speaking, decisions get worse with time and fatigue. So any place that you can use generative AI to offload some of the decision-making process from humans or to augment it, right? Because it doesn't necessarily mean taking it from human, but instead of having to have a human synthesize all the things and think through it, you can have the AI generate a report like, okay, based on the problem space that you're addressing, here's the top 3 choices, think through this. And again, this is something that I use ChatGPT for all the time. It's like, okay, help me think through what are the questions that I'm forgetting to ask myself, that sort of thing. And by having the machine do some of the thinking for me, it preserves my cognitive energy for other problems. Speaking of problem solving is also very, very cognitively demanding, whether you're trying to solve a financial problem, a legal problem, a technology problem. Having something that you can bounce ideas off of, or ideally actually just pipe it into your existing products and services and platforms, where either it can solve the problem for you or it can help you solve problems. Again, this is going to be a high value add where the overall intelligence of your organization will go up if you use generative AI to help your organization solve problems better, but it also save your employees' brain power for the problems that AI is not yet capable of solving. Learning is something that all humans do. It's natural, it's instinctive, it's reflexive. You don't even need to think about doing it, but when you put yourself in a position where you're deliberately learning and stretching your mind, that is very exhausting. It's very taxing. And so what you can do is you can use these tools to help streamline your training, your learning. And what that does is that you can meet everyone where they are for your training programs. And you can also often learn faster because then you have an interactive modality, and you can basically create an internal customized tutor that says, okay, here's the company's training material, let's get through it. And then instead of just like watching a brain dead boring video that nobody actually cares about anyways, you can have an interactive experience, which one will make the training more engaging, and that level of engagement means that people will enjoy it more and they'll retain it better. And then, of course, that's, corporate training is one thing, but there's also the acquisition of new skills. So let's say you're onboarding a new product or a new service, or you're shipping a new product and service and you need to teach people about it. So remember that learning is very cognitively demanding, and AI chatbots are already good at tutoring and teaching. And so this, again, is a way where you can use the AI not to replace humans, but to augment humans and bring them to the next level. Creativity. Synthesizing new ideas is also very, very difficult. It's very cognitively demanding. And while technologies like ChatGPT and others are not technically creating anything new, most humans don't create anything new anyways. We just remix stuff that we've experienced, which is not any different from what generative AI does. And also, within the context of business, you don't necessarily need to create anything entirely 100% new. What you do need to do is take the things that you know and then deploy them with good application. You need to find the right solution for the problem that you're facing, whether it's a marketing problem, legal, finance, HR, right? If you need to come up with a creative solution for an HR issue, again, ChatGPT knows enough about the human condition and emotions and all this other stuff to help you think through and come up with creative solutions, whatever it is that you're doing. And then finally, planning, as I mentioned, planning is very cognitively demanding. And this includes forecasting, anticipation, or even predicting the future. And so basically one thing that you can do is you can ask ChatGPT, say like, hey, these are the business trends that I'm seeing. This is what the market's doing. Help me think through this. And it's not necessarily going to be 100% right, but that's not the point. What I'm saying is you're not using it to replace your ability to plan. You're using it to augment your ability to plan. So the golden rule for all of this, one of the best ways you can use generative AI, this golden rule is preserve human cognition for when you really need it. So this design principle goes, it's relatively old. This is one of the chief design principles in the Unix operating system, which treats human cognition as a scarce resource. But also, this is how jet fighters work. So the avionics research industry, particularly for military, realized that you needed to treat a pilot's cognitive attention as a very scarce resource. And so the avionics in jet fighters only gets their attention when they absolutely need it. And so if you watch the Top Gun Maverick movie, one of the scenes where the plane is like spiraling towards the ground, and the alarm starts where it's like, pull up, pull, and then as the level of danger rises, the alarm changes, right? And so that change in tone, what that does is it calls the pilot's attention to something that they need to pay attention to immediately. And so that is an example of how attention engineering can be used for good rather than the way that it's used in social media. And this is just an example, but if the whole point here is that the point of cognitive offload is to treat your employees' brain power, those 2 hours of high performance cognitive labor, as a very scarce resource. So then instead of using their raw brain power to do the work manually, instead, they use a machine to offload as much of that as possible so that then they can protect their productivity for elsewhere. So here's some questions to ask. So these are based on questions that I often ask when I'm consulting. And these are the questions that I ask to zoom into and find, okay, where is it that you need to use generative AI and how do you employ it? So the first question, what activities are the most menial, tedious, and time-consuming? What do you avoid doing because it's just too painful? So this is a really good question. I usually start with something like this, especially if my client or whatever doesn't really know what they need or know how to deploy generative AI. It's like, okay, what are your pain points? And of course, this is a business practice that is as old as business itself. What are your pain points? Let's see if we can address those pain points with generative AI. And the way that it can address it is look at cognitive offload and new capabilities. The second question is, what activities actually add value? What is the objectively beneficial business output of a given activity? Or in other words, what is the value proposition? What is the activity that you're doing that is actually giving something to your customers? What are you getting paid to do? What is the outcome that they're looking for? Because if you apply generative AI directly to your outputs, to the things that bring in revenue, obviously that's good for business. What a lot of startups are doing right now is trying to invent new products and new services to create entirely new revenue streams. But there's plenty of existing businesses out there that could probably help their top line, get the net income up by providing more goods and services, either at a cheaper price or adding some novel features to their products and services. But by actually paying attention to the objective business value of any activity, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the business outputs. It could be the outputs of a given department, the HR department, your legal department, your IT department, your marketing department, right? Because what is the output of the marketing department? You generate leads, which can lead to revenue. So that's what I mean by outputs. What is the objective value added? Number 3, how do you know that an activity is successful? Whether it's a KPI, intuition, experience, what is it that you actually pay attention to know that you have been successful? The reason that this is a good question for generative AI is because sometimes it's not obvious how generative AI can help you be more successful. So if if you're looking for an intangible, right? Like maybe you need to build customer trust or build rapport. That is something that might surprise you, but ChatGPT and other similar technologies can actually help you with. You say hey, I've got a customer that I'm cultivating. Let me feed you in a profile for this customer. Let's talk about this customer and let's connect with what they actually need, right? How can I make this customer trust me? How can I earn their trust, right? And so that's just one example of where if it's a marketing, a sales team, generative AI can help them increase their level of success if you pay attention to what it is that actually makes them successful. And it does not necessarily have to be something that you can put a number on. In fact, a lot of business is something that is very difficult to measure objectively. Now, that being said, ChatGPT doesn't necessarily need metrics. This is one of the biggest differences between conventional machine learning and artificial intelligence and generative AI. It operates in qualitative space, not quantitative space. This is the biggest fundamental difference between data science in the past and data science today, is that pivot from quantitative data, numbers, forecast, linear regression, that sort of thing, to qualitative information. What is it that this person likes and why, and how do you earn their trust? And finally, question number 4, what activities are the highest priority or highest stakes? In other words, where would having an extra brain or an extra set of eyes make the most difference? So this is something where often if something is high priority or high stakes, that's like the sweet spot, right? That is the meat and potatoes of your business, because that is the set of tasks that only humans can do right now, and they're going to be the bottleneck, right? So what I mean by that is I used to work at managed service providers. And so, one of the biggest things was uptime. If the data center goes down or a service goes down, that's money out the door. So that means that's a very high priority task. And so if I were consulting for a managed service provider and they said, Dave, how can we use generative AI to help our bottom line? I said, what are the biggest priorities that you have? And it's like, well, if we have a severity 1, we need to all hands on deck. And one thing, this is just from my experience in technology, one thing is that a lot of people are very reactive. I actually had to leave a job because my boss did not understand the value of eliminating technical debt. And so he's just like, oh, well, we have fire alarms on a daily basis, and that's just the way things are. And I said, no, the hell it isn't. Like, prevention is what we should be doing, right? If your fire department is overtaxed because everything is burning down, maybe you need new fire code. He didn't get that, so I left that job. But my point is that there are going to be key risks and key business activities that are responsible for a good chunk of the money coming in and the money going out. So that's what I mean by high priority and high stakes. You pay attention to those things first, and you fix them as much as you can by adding generative AI to make to change those ratios so that you got more coming in and less going out. You can ask, and as a CEO, you can ask these questions of every department head. You can also look at it from an internal perspective or an external perspective. How do you engage with your customers, your vendors, your clients? How do you engage with your internal stakeholders? How do you engage with your financial stakeholders, your shareholders? Generative AI can apply to literally every level of business. Okay, so on the tool side, so we talked about the people and the processes. Let's talk about the tools. First, one thing that you can do, one of the approaches is that you can create drop-in tools. So one thing that a lot of people get wrong is they try and build tools that require a fundamentally different workflow, and it's a fundamentally different approach to business. And this is something that I often talk about for startups, where they're like, oh, we've got this great new tool that we're building. It's based on generative AI, and I'm like, okay, great, but how are businesses going to use it? Is this gonna require them to adopt an entirely new workflow? Is it gonna replace existing tools? Or ideally, it's a drop-in tool that just goes in alongside every other tool in their toolbox. So for instance, in the marketing department, they already use file servers, they already use Photoshop, they use Adobe and image services, stock image services. So in that case, image generators like Stable Diffusion and Midjourney and Adobe's Firefly, these are all drop-in tools where they fit into the existing workflows perfectly. And so whether you're looking at adopting a generative AI tool or service, make sure that it will fit into your existing workflows, because that's where you're going to get the most value out of it. If it's a tool that requires a fundamentally different approach, the path to adoption is just that much harder. And I saw this back in my IT infrastructure days all the time, where it's like, yeah, there's a great new powerful tool, but like we can't really use it because it doesn't integrate with anything else that we do, and it's going to fundamentally change the way we do business, which just means it's not a good fit. and this is something for startup CEOs to keep in mind. It's also something for CEOs that are not tech centric or AI centric when adopting AI tools. Make sure that you get those drop-in tools. Another thing to keep in mind is that general purpose tools like ChatGPT are often the hardest to use because you have to know a lot about the tool, you have to know a lot about what it is that you're trying to do, and you have to interact with it in a very fundamentally different way than you've ever interacted with any technology tool in the past. So because of that, part of what makes a drop-in tool is going to be the affordances and user experience design that says, oh, this is just like this other piece of software that I use, this other app that I use all the time. It just has some AI baked into it, and it's really easy to use. This is one of the things that I consulted with in the early days, was there was a lot of people just putting together generic dashboards of AI tools, and I'm like, you have no coherent strategy. There's nothing about this that just stands out and says, I know exactly what this tool is for. So basically what you're trying to optimize for is make your generative AI tool as intuitive as possible, where you can just pick someone off the street, put them in front of the app, and they say, oh, I know exactly what this does, and I know exactly how to use it just by guessing. If you can do that, then you almost certainly have a drop-in tool. Now, the other thing that you can do is you can improve existing systems. So this could be, if you've got Teams, if you've got Slack, if you've got Exchange, or even log services or whatever. And of course, that's just all looking at it from the IT side. There's plenty of other business platforms, whether it's your financial workflows, your marketing workflows, if you're not trying to add a new tool, what you can do is, if you have access to the code base, for your internally developed tools, you can add generative AI at some of these decision points in order to make it just a little bit better, a little bit faster. So the primary example I have in my head is ServiceNow and other internal management things like that. So let's say you have ticket routing, you've got follow-ups, you've got emails. So basically, instead of having humans do a lot of the work, you can have the machine do a lot of the work for the humans and say, hey, which one of these emails do you want to send to this customer as a follow-up? Or if there's a ticketing system, you can have the ticketing system ask a few obvious questions before a human even looks at it, so that by the time your ticket gets escalated to an actual engineer or whoever it gets to, a few questions have already been asked immediately, and so there's more context, which can reduce your MTTX. Another place that you can look at it is human intervention, where it can either be routing to the correct human. So I was actually just talking to a friend about this on the medical side, who's at a startup trying to use generative AI, which is if there's a patient need, how do you route it to the correct medical provider? That is a great use case, because you can feed a whole patient chart into the LLM and say what competencies does this person need right now, and then you get the exact right thing, and then you make sure that nurse or specialist also gets the exact notes that they need without having to go talk to a bunch of other people. Because heck, several of my Patreon supporters are in the medical field, and they talk about just how annoying it is when charts aren't updated correctly, and when physicians and nurses don't talk to each other, or they forget to pass something on. So again, you can reduce human interaction, you can reduce the need for human intervention by having some of these interactions automated. And then finally, cognitive offload. If you go hunting across your organization for the things that are really demanding, those are ways that you can improve existing systems, because you reduce the frustration. That will increase productivity, increase satisfaction, and that also just all speaks to the bottom line. Okay, so that was people, processes, and tools. Let's talk about better, faster, and cheaper. Otherwise, how do you get the best return on investment from any generative AI initiative, whether it's a product or service that you're thinking about adopting or one that you're building internally? So the primary three questions here that you should ask yourself is, what can generative AI do better than humans? What can it do faster than humans? And what can it do cheaper than humans? And so this is what I mean, where it's like, okay, if you can offset some of the labor costs, you can Ideally, hopefully, you preserve your existing headcount, but you take your organization to the next level and you can double, triple, quadruple productivity while also doing cognitive offload so your human employees are happier. So this is a universal truth of technology. Technology has always been a force multiplier. So, the Industrial Revolution example that I always love to give is the tractor. Tractors are very complicated, they're expensive, heavy pieces of equipment, but we still use them because they have the physical power output of literally hundreds of horses. And so you get rid of instead of feeding and providing veterinary care for hundreds of horses, you have a tractor that all it does is drink gasoline, needs some oil, and some replacement parts every now and then. Generative AI is a cognitive force multiplier. So let me say that again. The first the first three industrial revolutions were more about communication force multiplication and physical force multiplication. Generative AI is the first example of a cognitive force multiplier. It doesn't just send email faster, right? Because, email came around in the 80s or whatever, which is like, okay, cool, communication now happens faster. That's not really cognitive labor. Or crunching numbers, right? Math, definitely very cognitively demanding, but this is a new era of cognitive labor force multiplication. So that's why this video has cognitive offload as a central lesson, as something to look for when you're trying to integrate generative AI into your business. Better. So keep your ear to the ground, but basically ChatGPT has already demonstrated superior clinical judgment than many doctors, and this is according to Harvard research. It also has better executive judgment, executive reasoning than many people, and this includes managers and some CEOs. And so in this case, look for the activities where generative AI is demonstrably superior to humans. This will give you obviously a competitive advantage, but if it is better than you, use the machine, right? Humans can go use a rake and a hoe and plow the field, but we don't have humans doing it by hand anymore because the machine is better. So just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should, especially if the machine is better than you at it. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily mean get handed over to the machine entirely, but you should be using the machine to augment your abilities. So in the case of doctors, if there is any room for doubt, maybe doctors should be required, or maybe not required, but as part of the medical resourcing system, like Epic and Cerner and stuff, you integrate some language model technology into that, where it's like, okay, cool, based on this patient's chart and test results, have you thought of X, Y, and Z? Just enough to clue in the physician on the direction that maybe they need to go in order to augment human judgment and augment human executive reasoning. Now, one thing about this is that unless you have a product or service where they've done the work and they can say, look, this AI service that we've built is demonstrably better than humans, you're going to need to figure that out for yourself through experimentation and consultation. And also, as I mentioned earlier, you will need to start measuring some things qualitatively rather than quantitatively. So if the objective is patient satisfaction or customer satisfaction or trust or any number of those other intangible things, they can be a lot harder to measure. But fortunately, language models can help you measure those things through approximations. And so what I mean by that is just ask ChatGPT, how can I measure customer satisfaction or trust or whatever? And it'll give you some cool ideas about how you can measure that. And then you say, well, what's the difference between quantitative and qualitative? Trust me, if you do that experiment, you'll see what I'm talking about. But again, this is no different from using machines to do things that humans either couldn't or shouldn't do. A forklift, right? Yes, a human could unpack a pallet and put everything in the, on a new pallet in the truck, but it's easier to just use the forklift to pick up the pallet as a whole and put it in the truck for you. Likewise, there's going to be some things that generative AI, it can just do that a human can't, or that would take a human way too long to do. So just offload those things and let the machine do it because it's already better than the human. Faster. So generative AI is super, super, super fast. It can read literally like 20 pages of text in a few seconds. No human is capable of that. And then it can use that text. It can either summarize it, brainstorm, extend it. It can draft a new version. All of this happens really, really fast. And of course, time is money, right? Velocity is speed plus direction. So you got to make sure you're going in the right direction. But basically, so this is another thing that I do when I'm consulting, is I say, what takes the longest? So when I consult with scientists and academics, it's like, oh, well, writing grants takes forever. Grant proposals, grant reviews, that takes forever. Or writing research papers and revising research papers takes a long time. Whatever business activities take the longest, those might be good targets for generative AI. Not related to generative AI, but many, many years ago, earlier in my IT infrastructure days, I was working at a small medical software startup, and we got a couple new servers, and I added these new servers to their build network. And so then their software builds went from 26 hours to 2. And they said, well, Dave, you threw off our entire workflow because instead of kicking off a build and then just coming back the next day, we just go to lunch and come back, and now we have to keep working. But again, if you can, and technology can do this, you can shorten things by a factor of 10x or 100x. I usually look at the things that can happen that we can shorten by 100x. Say, okay, what takes the longest here? We've got some lawyer friends, right? There's a bunch of active lawsuits out there. And I said, okay, given that we have generative AI that can read and summarize, hundreds of pages of legal documents really fast, how can I build a tool that is going to really help you get to the bottom of these things really quick? So again, looking at ways that generative AI can speed up really basic stuff, just reading, right? Don't underestimate the power of speeding up really basic tasks. Another example is that I've built my own tools that I use for helping revise my writing. ChatGPT still sucks at writing, by the way. So I don't use it for writing. I use it for revisions and providing feedback, because that's something it is really good at. It says, hey, I just read this whole chapter. Let me give you some feedback on it. And it gives really good feedback. I know, because I've paid a professional editor, and it gives me feedback at a very similar level as a professional editor. Now, that being said, it does miss a lot of stuff. But instead of a 2-month turnaround, I get a 30-minute turnaround. So that's what I mean by look for things that you can accelerate by a factor of 10x or 100x. So let's see, going from 2 months or 60 days to 30 minutes, that's, 60x, and then instead of hours, it's minutes. You're looking at a 200x speed up by using ChatGPT API for getting feedback rather than using a human. So again, that level of speed up is absolutely possible with generative AI. Look for those, and you're going to really make a very good difference in some departments. And then finally, cheaper. Here's the thing, is that a lot of stuff costs a lot. And human labor is one of the most expensive parts of many businesses. And the best expense is no expense. So what I mean by that is, unfortunately, we are seeing where many companies are doing huge layoffs as they pivot. And I don't know if those jobs are ever coming back, but that kind of goes outside of the scope of this video. But what I mean by that is that if there is something that you can do cheaper with AI than paying a human, or you can empower a human to do the same task faster and therefore cheaper, that is kind of the direction to look at. So where can you lower costs with generative AI? This one is actually a lot harder to do because, again, it's better at some things, and it's certainly faster at some things, but you still need human oversight. You still need human, guess and check or whatever. You need experts supervising these systems. But with that being said, there are ways that you can probably lower costs because, again, ChatGPT as a $20 a month assistant, it can do the work of literally thousands of dollars worth of cognitive labor for you per month, so that you don't need to hire a research assistant or that sort of thing, which then frees up the cognitive labor of other humans. But again, look at where it's cheaper. Generative AI in the form of image generators, much cheaper than graphic artists, which is really unfortunate for the graphics artists out there. And I don't have a solution. But from a business perspective, this says okay, hey, we can get a lot more art done much faster and much cheaper than with the humans. You still often need humans to do touch-ups and that sort of thing, and to even drive the machines. But again, much cheaper because it is faster. You can also use it to do SWOT analyses and that sort of thing. Again, that goes back to the cognitive reasoning, where you can use generative AI to help look at and control those outflows. And then, so this is, we're closing in on the end of the video. One thing that I really want to point out, particularly for the managers, the middle managers, and the executives watching, is that you need to be using generative AI to augment yourself. Whether this is using tools like ChatGPT to develop your sense of empathy and to be more diplomatic, to even be more vulnerable, to learn to be more vulnerable with your customers, your employees, your star players, that sort of thing. You use that and you will develop better relationships, and you'll develop more trust and have a lot more of that intangible benefit of working with your employees, but employees inside the company and then customers outside the company. Introspection. So this is one of the most unsung things that all leaders need to do, is using these tools, whether it's ChatGPT or the reflective journaling tool that I built or anything else. Understanding how your own mind works and what makes you tick is absolutely critical to being a good leader, because if you're doing things for the wrong reason, you need to be aware of that so that you can fix that and make sure that you're doing things for the right reason. Introspection and the way that generative AI can help with that is really, really good. And then finally, smarter. If you're not using generative AI to learn more, faster, to make sure that you have good understanding, you will be left behind. And so this is something, like, I know I'm saying that like really bluntly, but the fact of the matter is, if you're not using generative AI to make yourself smarter, to make smarter decisions, your competition is. So it's that simple. And then lastly, ethics and courage. I've mentioned a few times during this video that in some cases, I think generative AI will inevitably lead to layoffs, job loss, and that sort of thing. There's going to be really tough decisions ahead for a lot of people. And the competition may undercut you, and you might feel like you have to compromise your principles and your values in order to stay competitive. The thing is, it's a foregone conclusion that technology will disrupt markets. Do you remember Borders? Borders imploded because of Amazon. That's just the name of the game. So if you need to close the doors and pivot, maybe that's what you need to do. And it really sucks because nobody wants to go out of business. Nobody wants to lay off, hundreds or thousands of employees because you're going out of business. That being said, it's probably going to happen. Now, even if you don't go out of business, layoffs and pivots are coming. They're actively happening. Like you remember telephone operators? Telephone industry didn't go away, but telephone operators did. And so going through these pivots is going to be very difficult and very painful for some people. So what I want to leave you with is this idea that there are 3 guiding principles that you should probably keep in mind as you embrace generative AI, and that is trust, dignity, and respect. So first, make decisions that prioritize earning and keeping trust. Once trust is lost, it is very difficult to get back. And if you look at some of the technology or tech companies out there that have abused the market's trust, abused their customer trust by violating privacy and that sort of stuff, I got to tell you, like, I'm never going back to those platforms. I don't care what they do. And so if you sell your trust, if you sell your trustworthiness in the age of generative AI, you will probably not be able to get that back, because above all else, a lot of people are caring more and more about privacy and not being abused and manipulated by the corporations that we engage with. If you watch my channel, you know that I am very, very skeptical of corporations. That being said, I also understand that corporations are here for a reason, and they provide critical goods and services to all of us. So make sure that you put trust front and center with the way that you deploy and use generative AI and the decisions that you make, strategic decisions you make around generative AI. Dignity. So this is something that is one of those more intangible things, which is, how do you prioritize human dignity? This means treating people with respect, respecting the dignity of their time off, respecting the dignity of their competence, their fear. So this is another thing. A lot of people are absolutely paralyzed by fear because they don't know what's coming. And as a CEO, you might not know what's coming either, but if you treat people with dignity and you say, you know what, I'm not going to compromise on this value, then they're going to like you more. They're going to give you more of the benefit of the doubt and trust you to see it through. And then finally, respect. Respect for human rights, respect for privacy, respect for the way that people feel. If you prioritize respect as well as trust and dignity, then even if your company implodes or even if you have to lay off people, you won't regret it. Put it that way. You will not ever regret prioritizing trust, dignity, and respect, no matter what else happens. And so with this, my caution to all executives and leaders out there in the age of generative AI is do not compromise your ethics and principles, but also be courageous and make some bold decisions, because if you're not making bold decisions, other people will. So for a quick recap, we talked about the people, processes, and tools around generative AI. Generative AI is just like any other software. It provides new capabilities, new opportunities, but also new threats. One of the key ways to look at generative AI is look at where it's better, faster, and or cheaper than humans. This is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck when you're either building your own generative AI tools or you're buying or procuring generative AI goods and services. And then second to last was self-improvement. As an executive leader, if you're not using generative AI to improve yourself, somebody else is, namely your competition, and you're going to get left behind. And then lastly, the slide that we just did was ethics and courage, which means whatever happens, whatever's coming, if you compromise your ethics, you might regret it. But if you don't compromise your ethics, you will not regret it. So choose the path of least regret. This is actually a mantra that I live by is, what decision will I regret least in the long run? And then be courageous about it, because again, this is a bold time with a tremendous amount of opportunity, but fortune favors the bold. So thanks for watching. I hope you got a lot out of this. Thank you very much. And again, reach out on LinkedIn or Patreon and let's talk if you want to talk about any of these topics. Cheers.